All right, how we doing, World War II class? Mr. Sharon here, doing a little audio overview of some of the stuff we've been going over these last few weeks in our closure. Hope you're all doing well. I do plan on doing a live Zoom conference soon. I know nobody showed up to the optional one last week, which is fine. I can't do one today because I'm going to the school actually to have some materials delivered to me that were left in the building. So, first thing I'd like to do is just do a quick little overview of the last PowerPoint we went over, the rise of the Axis powers. So I'm going to pop that up here, and you got the big three for the Axis powers. Obviously on the left you got Hitler, in the middle you got Benito Mussolini, who was actually the first of the three to rise to power, and then you have Hideki Tojo from Japan all the way to the right. He would technically be the Prime Minister of Japan. He was a military leader before he took control. So from these notes that you already reviewed, just a really quick overview. So Japan, out of the three eventual Axis powers who would cause a lot of problems in World War II, Japan was the first one to actually go on the offensive and take territory from another country. And they picked on China. There was a region called Manchuria, which is marked on the map here. So what Japan did is there were Japanese business owners who owned railroads in that part of China called Manchuria. They actually planted some bombs on railroad tracks and blamed it on Chinese terrorists. So they invaded the territory, saying that they had to take over that part of China because supposedly there were Chinese terrorists and maybe the Chinese government that was doing these terrorist attacks against Japanese business owners, which wasn't true, but that's just a story they made up. So the key point here is that the League of Nations, which was created after World War I, really didn't have any response to this. It was very weak. Japan decided not to listen. They dropped out of the League of Nations, and because Japan did that, a couple of years later, Germany would follow as soon as Hitler rose to power. So speaking of Germany and Hitler, as you saw in the PowerPoint, Hitler started to violate a bunch of provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. A couple of the big ones were the German military was only allowed to have 100,000 men in the army, and as you can see from this picture from 1935, it looks like there were more than 100,000 at this one military rally alone. There was supposed to be no conscription, which would be what we would call the draft. And they started to go against that, and they started to draft soldiers into the military. And there was also an agreement that Germany, after World War I, was really not allowed to have an air force. And as far as their navy went, they were allowed to have 6 battleships, no submarines, because we know U-boats caused a lot of problems in World War I, and they started to go against that. We look at 1936. Germany actually made an agreement with Britain. Great Britain decided that Germany could increase its navy as long as the German navy was never more than 35% of the size of the British navy. And the reason Britain did that is because when Hitler rose to power, they saw him as a potential threat, and immediately they wanted to start to kind of appease him, try to set him at ease, try to kind of establish some kind of positive relationship, which we know backfired and it just blew up in everyone's faces in the long run. Moving soldiers into the Rhineland, which was supposed to be a military buffer zone between France and Germany, to give France some time if Germany ever did decide to do another invasion. They didn't want German soldiers in that particular part of Germany. That was a really big move by Germany, moving soldiers in there. And there was some resistance, but certainly not on the scale that you would expect, considering that was part of the Treaty of Versailles, that Germany would not move soldiers into that territory. Looking at Italy, we saw this in the video that we watched before our closure. Mussolini wanted to build this new Roman Empire. Italy already had control of parts of North Africa. Ethiopia was a newly independent nation, and Mussolini figured it would be kind of easy to pick on an independent African nation rather than trying to invade a part of Africa that was under the control of Britain or France or Belgium, because then Mussolini knew he'd have a war against a European superpower by invading Ethiopia and getting their natural resources. Mussolini knew that the fight was really just going to be against this independent nation that no one else was probably really going to care too much. The United States passed neutrality acts, which were meant to try to keep us out of the war. At the same time, there was a civil war beginning in Spain. There was a fascist uprising inspired by what some of the Spanish military leaders had seen in Germany and Italy. The main leader of the uprising was a general called Francisco Franco, or named Francisco Franco. He reached out to Italy and Germany, and he actually got help from them. After he reached out for help, both Hitler and Mussolini started to supply weapons, money, soldiers to help for the cause, and by 1939, Spain would actually fall and become a fascist nation, which, although Spain never technically fought in World War II, they never helped the Axis powers, they were never officially an Axis power, it was one less nation that mainly Italy and Germany had to worry about, because they knew that Franco, if push came to shove, was going to be on their side, and Spain wasn't going to interfere with whatever the Axis powers were deciding to do in Europe. And this was really important for Italy and Germany because it gave them a chance to kind of battle test their soldiers and to try some military strategy in action, some of their new equipment. So this was like a practice run for what would become World War II. When things really heated up was when Hitler decides to invade Austria in March of 1938. So now there is a formal invasion of another nation. This wasn't just Hitler and Germany and Mussolini and Italy trying to help another country in a civil war. This is now Germany invading and taking over a country. As you can see, they marched into Austria with very little resistance. A couple of reasons for that. A lot of Austrians, being part of this new, smaller, divided up old Austro-Hungarian Empire, which used to be about 70 million people. Well, now you had Austria, you had Hungary, you had Czechoslovakia, parts of Romania, Yugoslavia, all these different smaller countries that had been divided out of the old empire. And for those people who were living in Austria, which was kind of this smaller, insignificant nation now, they saw an opportunity to become part of this big empire again. So there wasn't as much resistance there as you might have expected. The Nazis pretty much just marched in and took the country over. Obviously, one of the reasons that Hitler picked it, well, geographically speaking, if you look on a map, there it is. It's right by Germany. And also, it's the nation he was born in, so it had some sentimental value, in addition to the fact that there are a lot of people of German culture, German speaking, who lived in Austria. So in Hitler's eyes, this kind of made sense, especially as an easy target. So shortly after that, Hitler set his sights on Czechoslovakia, once again for those same reasons. There was a large number of people with German ancestry, German culture, as well as the geographic reason with Czechoslovakia being right next to Germany. So he went after an area called the Sudetenland. He lined soldiers up on the border. And this is when the rest of Europe started to get a little concerned. And they actually decided to set up a conference. And France and England met in Munich, Germany, with Hitler and Mussolini. And they appeased him, which appeasement means you give in to a bully's demands. And based on that reading I gave you, I talked about some of the reasons why that happened. And now we know, we've learned from our mistakes, you never appease a bully. You don't give them what they want, because all it leads to is them wanting more. So what happened at the Munich conference was England and France pretty much told Hitler, you can keep Austria, you can keep part of Czechoslovakia, but that's it. You can't take any more. We're going to let you keep that, and you're going to have to be happy with it. And Hitler said that he would agree to that. That's pretty much a quick overview of everything from that first PowerPoint, and now I'm going to move on to the second one. All right, picking up from where we left off before, we're looking at the timeline of German conquest. So, at the Munich conference, when Hitler was appeased, he agreed that that was it. As long as they let him keep Austria and part of Czechoslovakia, this western part, the Sudetenland, that was it. He'd be happy, and he'd leave everybody alone. There was supposed to be world peace. As we know, it didn't work out that way. Shortly after, in March 1939, the Nazis went in and they took over all of Czechoslovakia. And the excuse that they made was supposedly the government of Czechoslovakia and supposedly the government of Austria beforehand was discriminating against people of German ancestry within their countries. We know that wasn't true, but at the time, that's the story that Hitler was selling. And apparently, England and France and some other countries kind of bought into it for whatever reason. In May 1939, another very important development. The two had worked together in the Spanish Civil War, but now they would finally have an official military alliance. Germany and Italy would have the Pact of Steel, which would lead to the Axis powers. In August 1939, another really important step for Hitler to be able to continue his conquest. The way he was expanding was all eastward at the time. And if you look at the map, if he kept going eastward, eventually he was going to hit one of the big world superpowers, the Soviet Union. And to try to avoid any trouble with the Soviets, they actually reached out. Hitler and Stalin never officially met, but representatives from the two countries met, and they came up with something called the Non-Aggression Pact. So the Non-Aggression Pact essentially just was an agreement that the two countries would not fight against each other. It wasn't a military alliance. They would not fight alongside each other. They simply agreed that they would not use aggression against one another. They would respect each other's territory. And regardless if what Hitler was trying to accomplish here was if he wanted to go in and invade, let's say, Poland or Romania, which are on the Soviet border, according to this agreement, it was not a threat toward the Soviets. They would not view it as a threat. And as long as no German soldiers stepped foot into Soviet territory, they wouldn't have an issue. So the pact was written, it was agreed to, and there was actually a secret part of the pact which ignited World War II. So the secret part was not only did they agree they would not fight against one another, but they also used this as an opportunity to get rid of the country that was in between them, Poland. So as part of the secret part of the Non-Aggression Pact, Germany would invade Poland, take roughly half of it, and then a couple weeks later, roughly, the Soviet Union would invade and take over the other half. It would cease to exist, they would split up the territory, and there you go. So that's what happened. September 1939, Germany invades Western Poland. It was called Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war. It was a new style of warfare. The world had never seen anything like this before, with such a drastic use, such a significant use of mechanized warfare, with tanks on the ground, planes in the sky. The bombing raids were done really quickly, and then right after bombing raids happened, you had the tanks come in with thousands of soldiers on the ground. And no one had just ever seen this type of force used in warfare before. And it was really terrifying for the rest of the world to be seeing this. Not to mention for those in Poland. I have some videos here if you want to watch them. They're very informative. I definitely recommend them. So after the invasion of Poland, France and Great Britain declare war against Germany. Finally. So instead of appeasing Hitler further and saying he could keep that part of Poland, they said enough's enough. Unfortunately for France and Great Britain, any action that they might have taken was definitely discouraged when the Soviet Union went in and took over the other half of Poland. So there was a lot of uncertainty here. Were the Soviets and the Germans now working together? with France and England declaring war against Germany, did this mean that if they actually took action against Germany, that the Soviets were going to jump in and help Germany? That definitely wasn't something that France and Britain wanted at the time. But there was a formal declaration of war. I have more videos here if you want to watch about the Soviet invasion of Poland. And also there's a lot of talk about World War II. In my regular class, I usually show a documentary. I don't think I'm going to assign it for this kind of revised version that we're doing for the closure. But it's now known that there was widespread Pervitin use, which we would call crystal meth, amongst the Nazis and their soldiers. And this is one of the reasons they were able to do these blitzkrieg attacks. Soldiers literally wouldn't sleep for 3 days on end. You had these methamphetamines that kept them going. But at the same time that this kind of made them super soldiers temporarily, it was absolutely destroying their bodies, destroying their minds. It made them addicted. And then when they stopped getting supplies of it in ample time, they started to go through extreme withdrawal that could lead to death. And once they were on this stuff long enough, same thing, pretty much drive them insane and lead to death because of all the damage it did to their bodies. But one of those dark parts of World War II, I mean, everything about it's pretty dark, but the drug use did play a pretty extensive role, at least for the German part. And the Allies also experimented with drugs as well. So after war was declared by France and England, not much was done for a pretty long period of time, actually almost a year, a little short of a year. And this era of time was called the Phony War, or the Sitzkrieg, because everyone just kind of sat around. So even though there was a formal declaration of war, France and England did not do any invasions of Germany. They didn't do anything to try to help the Polish. This was just a time that was spent to try to build up their militaries. So formal declaration of war on paper, but there was no actual fighting. At the same time this was going on, simultaneously, the Soviets said, hey, with everybody all kind of caught up with what Germany's doing, let's take advantage of the opportunity. So there were three, actually before we get to that, before the 3 Baltic states, the Soviets decided to try to take back one of the territories they lost, one of the territories that Russia had lost during World War I, which was Finland. So Finland had only been independent for about 20 years now. So the Soviets went in and they tried to take over Finland. This was called the Winter War, and it went on for quite some time, November 1939 through March 1940. But you got to give the Finns a lot of credit. They put up a lot more resistance than anyone expected out of a country of about 5 million, taking on the Soviets, who were, don't quote me here, but I would assume over 200 million strong at the time, population-wise. It was pretty remarkable that Finland was able to take them on. Had a little joke here. Whatever. It used to be funny. Not sure if it is anymore. With the Winter War, the main outcome is Finland only lost 1/10 of its territory. Not too bad. The main reason they were able to do that is home field advantage. They knew the territory better. They knew the weather better. They dressed up in all white uniforms. They hid in the snow. They used a lot of snipers. They were known in the Winter War for being very effective with their snipers, having one guy being able to take out 20, 30 Soviets. And eventually the Soviets were just suffering too much loss and decided to withdraw. The US did try to provide some aid to Finland at the time. They didn't want to see communism spread. So I guess you could say the US was semi-successful since Finland only lost 1/10 of its territory. After that, the Soviets decided to try to go and take back other areas that Russia had lost as a result of World War I. This time they were more successful. These were called the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And eventually, the way the Soviets kind of weaseled their way into these territories is they sent the military in, saying that they wanted to form mutual assistance treaties. They said they only wanted to have some presence in these 3 nations to protect them against an eventual invasion by Hitler in Germany. But as soon as the Soviets got a strong military foothold there, they turned on the governments and overthrew all three of them and took over. Eventually, ironically, the Germans would go in and invade after the Soviets had already taken those three countries over. And this would kind of begin the conflict between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So the non-aggression pact eventually was off the table. And then I got some funny stuff here. Famous Lithuanians, famous Latvians, famous Estonians. And take a look at that. The Battle of France. So after the Sitzkrieg was over, one of the first places that Hitler decided to attack was France. Very similar to World War I with the Schlieffen Plan. Germany figured you get France out of the way and you don't really have any other big superpowers to worry about aside from the UK on that side of Europe. But the UK is across the English Channel, so that would kind of make it difficult for the UK to launch a land invasion. So a couple things happened. First, the Netherlands ends up falling to Germany, strategically important. And then they go into Belgium. And all along, France had kind of been waiting to take any action. They didn't want to strike first. They were still trying to build up their military. Once Germany went on the offensive, they didn't really have much of a choice. But unfortunately for France and unfortunately for the rest of the world, Germany, once again with this blitzkrieg style of warfare, attacking really quickly, they were able to pretty much surprise the French and catch them off guard. They did that by going through this area kind of around the Luxembourg area, you can probably see on the map there, called the Ardennes Forest. And France didn't expect anyone to be able to launch an invasion through there. The Ardennes Forest, it didn't have any roads you could go through. Germany literally bushwhacked their ways all the way just about into Paris. Most of the best French troops have been stationed up north. There was a line of defense called the Maginot Line, which the French had built in the years between World War I and World War II. And it was just a bunch of military fortifications, walls, spikes that were put in the ground to try to prevent Germany from getting through. And they figured Germany wouldn't be able to get through there. They wouldn't go through the Ardennes Forest. So most of their soldiers were up north. And that was just a big miscalculation because Germany did go through the weaker parts of the Maginot Line. And as I mentioned, they bushwhacked their way through the forest. There's another map of this. So this Maginot Line that France had built, which didn't end up working out as well as they had anticipated. Here's some pictures of it. So this is what Germany had to get through. Apparently, this Maginot Line wasn't as reliable or dependable as the French had hoped. So it didn't take long. After a couple weeks of this German invasion of France, something was launched called Operation Dynamo. If anyone watches Dunkirk, I haven't seen it yet, but apparently this is shown very well in Dunkirk. That's what the movie's about, is that roughly 2 weeks in which the French and some English soldiers who had showed up to try to help had to evacuate back to the UK across the English Channel, because if they stayed and fought against the Nazis, it meant certain death or imprisonment. June 10th, Italy joins the war. They start to invade France as well. France had pretty much fallen by that point. And from that point on, France becomes part of Nazi Germany. There was a southern part, the Free Zone, called Vichy France, which, even though it technically wasn't part of Nazi Germany, we know that the Germans were calling all the shots in terms of who the leaders were there. And there was a small part that was also an Italian occupation zone. You can see it in the green part on the map. So this ended a long-running government of France that had been in power for 70 years called the French Third Republic. And yeah, that would pretty much be it for France until D-Day, roughly 4 years later, when the Allies would come back in and try to take it back. So you can see the map of Europe as of June 1940. France had now fallen. All the nations with an X across them had been taken over by Germany. So essentially they were now part of the Axis powers. All the countries that are underlined were formally part of the Axis alliance. All the countries with the hammer and sickle, the communist symbol there, had been taken over by the Soviet Union. So things weren't looking too good for Europe. And you also have to consider that although Spain just looks like Spain here, they were a fascist nation and they weren't going to get involved in the fight, but they weren't going to resist anything that the Axis powers were doing because on paper they were pretty much allies. So moving ahead, the next big step here was Hitler decided he wanted to try to take over the United Kingdom. He definitely miscalculated here and tried to do it too early, fresh off the invasion of France. He might have waited a little while, but I guess he didn't want to give Britain too much time to build up their military. So he launched an air invasion. There was never a ground invasion of soldiers, but it was an Air Force versus Air Force battle that raged through the summer, through the fall of 1940. And eventually we consider this a British victory because the Germans retreat after losing thousands of planes. For every one British plane that was shot down in this Air Force battle, roughly 2 to 3 German planes were lost. So it was becoming too costly and too time-consuming for Germany to continue on. They decided to call it off for a while, and then they made another gross miscalculation shortly after that. They figured, if you can't take the UK on, let's go after the Soviet Union, which they had a non-aggression pact with, which most historians agree there was really no reason they had to do that at that point. But Hitler didn't trust communists, Hitler didn't trust Stalin, and he decided that that was the next best move to make at the time. The British Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. Churchill gave a lot of speeches around this time period when one of the most famous ones was, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them on the landing grounds. You can listen to this speech if you like. This was done shortly before the Battle of Britain, and it definitely helped to give some inspiration to the British, who were definitely scared on what they were seeing happening across Europe. As far as the United States goes, we started a cash and carry policy. Originally with the Neutrality Acts, we said we simply wouldn't help any nation in a state of war. In 1939, we changed our tune on that because now our buddies over in England and France were in trouble. And we said, hey, if you need weapons, if you need ammunition, if you pay us in cash, if you have the cash to do that, we'll let you have it. You got to buy it from us, though. We're not going to let you borrow anything. The second part of the arrangement was any weapons or ammunition you want, you bring your ships across the Atlantic Ocean, you dock them in the U.S., you load everything you need onto the ship and bring it back. The United States will not transport weapons to Europe because that will get us tied up into the war. Another significant move, in 1940, there was a military draft. This was peacetime. It's the only peacetime military draft in U.S. history. Every other draft we've had, we were in some kind of formal conflict. At this point, we weren't in World War II, but we forced people to sign up into the military because we knew it was inevitable. And we didn't want to get stuck having to spend months or years building up a military after declaring war. We wanted to be proactive about this. We have some quotes here on this slide. Eventually, we went to the Lend-Lease Act, which pretty much was an extension of the cash and carry. Once we joined the war, we just started to lend weapons to our allies. You didn't have to have cash. We brought weapons to our allies in both the Soviet Union and the UK. But at that point, we kind of had to. So this all leads to the last event I'm going to discuss, Pearl Harbor. So what a lot of people don't understand about Pearl Harbor is that one of the main reasons the Japanese attacked us is because at this point they had an alliance with the Axis powers, with Japan and Italy, with Germany and Italy mainly. And they were trying to do their own conquest of Asia. So they were still invading China. They're invading other parts of Asia. And in order to do that, it was all about mechanized warfare. For mechanized warfare, you need gasolines. So they were doing this mainly with their air force, with tanks, with ships. And their effort would be completely useless without gasoline. So the United States and some other countries set up an oil embargo where they encourage other countries to stop trading with Japan and to try to cut off their oil supply to slow them down. Well, Japan didn't like that. They launched a sneak attack at a U.S. naval base called Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And the statistics were pretty terrifying. So 2,403 were dead. They took out some battleships, destroyers. They picked this location because it was a naval base. And they figured they could try to take out some planes, some ships. They knew at this point that the U.S. would eventually be pulled into the war, and they wanted to really weaken us, set us back a couple months before we'd be ready to do that. That's pretty much that. So the Japanese Empire, you can see everything inside the red would belong to Japan at the height of their conquest during World War II. Some of these territories we'll be talking about later on were American. So the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island all fell to the Japanese. They never took over Pearl Harbor, but they did a lot of damage there. And then just to give you an idea of what a world war looks like, World War II, here's a map. You can read that little key down there. And pretty much the entire world ended up being involved to some extent. So that's it for this. If you have any questions, please reach out to me by email. Hopefully this was informative and it helps you to understand some of this information. Have a good day.